Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with my first ever poetry discussion for Aniara by Harry Martinson. This is a Swedish science fiction epic that was published in 1956. I'm calling this a discussion instead of a review because I don't actually think I am able to really review a poem. This is my first ever poem in years, and potentially the first that I've ever actually read in good faith and tried to understand. So I would rather call these discussions and just discuss my thoughts. There are also going to be spoilers, I guess, in this video if you consider there to be spoilers for poetry. There's really no way to discuss this poem without spoilers because it's just sort of about the same theme, and that is the point of the poem, and without that theme there is nothing to discuss. So if you want to read this and you don't want to be spoiled, if you are concerned about that, then I would recommend not watching this video. Aniara is the name of a spaceship that is taking refugees from Earth. Earth has been destroyed and people are fleeing, so the spaceship is taking them somewhere safe, I assume. Then they get knocked off course. I thought it was some kind of space storm while reading the poem, but Goodreads said it was a technological malfunction in the spaceship, so I would trust Goodreads more than my interpretation of this poem. Then they are stuck in this spaceship for the rest of eternity with nowhere they could possibly go, just thousands of people trapped in a single spaceship. There is an artificial intelligence on board that is called the Mima. Trapped in space with nothing to do, nowhere to go, and no hope for being saved, people turn to the Mima in order to show them something better, show them art, show them civilization, show them humanity, and the Mima gives them purpose in order to live. I rated this poem 3 stars. I'm not sure that I really should have rated it, but I felt like I would anyway. It was something that I read and I was going to rate it based on my feelings. I'm going to talk first about how I felt and some technical things and like my experience before I talk about the poem itself and what I thought about it. First, I will say that this is a narrative poem, which I think helped me a lot. It helped to have a storyline and an arc that I could grab onto with characters. It was like a novel kind of. I could imagine that this would exist as a novel. And I think that helped me versus a poem that was largely imagery. I think that was a good place to start, but I don't think starting with a 1950s Swedish translated poem was necessarily what I should have done, because I don't read a lot of classic sci-fi, and by a lot I mean I don't read classic sci-fi, I don't read poetry, so I just made this unnecessarily difficult for myself starting here. My boyfriend recommended this to me. He absolutely adores this poem. He read it earlier this year, and I think it had a great emotional impact on him. That was why I decided to go with something that was so far out of my comfort zone. The technical aspects of the poem that made it more difficult for me as a reader. First, I read it online. I normally read books in physical form just because that's easier for me, if I can sit there and flip through the pages. But this book is out of print, there's really nowhere to find it. I checked online and it's like hundreds of dollars for an old beat up paperback copy. So I read it in a text file online, which is not the best way to read anything, but especially a translated poem. My boyfriend and I both had kind of a number of questions about the translation itself. There were typos in it. It didn't necessarily feel right all the time. There were things that repeated. It would just like repeat lines or repeat stanzas. And with poetry, it's kind of hard to tell if that was intentional, if the author was doing that for a purpose, or if it was just a typo. So that definitely wasn't fantastic. And the other big issue I had was there were a lot of made-up words in the poem. It was a sci-fi poem. Harry Martinson made up a lot of words and used different terms for like Earth. Like there was a different word for Earth. I don't remember it, but there was. And there were different words for all kinds of technology. And there were just a lot of made up words, which is fine. And there was a glossary, but it was at the end of the document. And I didn't realize there was a glossary until after I'd finished the poem and scrolled all the way down. And I do think having that glossary, and if I was able to use it while reading the entire poem, that would have helped a lot with understanding. But all those things being said, I do want to get in and like discuss the actual poem itself. First is the title. Aniara is a Greek word that I think just means bleak or depressing or something along those lines, and it's a very good descriptor for this poem because this poem is one of the most depressing things that I have ever read. I think it gave my boyfriend an existential crisis, and that was when he decided that we should adopt a cat, and we named our cat the Mima, so that should tell you something. That's why her name is Mima. This poem existed to me in 2 parts. The first was the first 29 cantos, I believe they're called, of this poem. And then the second was canto 30 to about 104, I think was how many there were. This took me a month to read, but I read the first part very, very quickly. It was not particularly long. It was just hard for me to pick up and hard for me to force myself through it once I got to the latter portion. I loved the first part. The first part I thought was so wonderful, and I would honestly recommend reading the first 29 cantos just on their own, because for me, that was the bulk of the story. That was the part that meant something to me, and that was the part that I understood. What I understood of this poem, I loved. I thought the story of the Mima and these people trapped together was really beautifully done and beautifully crafted. I liked the language in it, which is kind of hard to say, and I don't really know how to talk about that, but I did think it was very beautifully done. But the second portion, which was like the last 70%, I guess, about of this poem, I didn't enjoy. And it wasn't that I thought it was bad, it was just that I didn't understand it. And not even just there was a little bit of misunderstanding or like I got confused at parts. I mean, I would read entire cantos where I did not understand a single thing that happened or what it was talking about. It went completely over my head. That was the part that sort of got away from the main story about the Mima and the spaceship, and it talked about the various people on board the spaceship and their lives back on Earth and how they kind of came to be in this situation. And I was very, very confused. I do think that the fact that the glossary was at the end and I was unable to use it, and the kind of iffy translation made that tenfold more difficult. But I do think even if it had been like perfectly translated and I had the glossary, I still don't think I would have understood it very well. But I genuinely think that it's worth it to read the first 29 cantos because when this poem was originally written, it existed just as those first 29 cantos. And that makes sense to me. I thought that was the story. That was what really mattered. And everything after was just kind of, I kept reading in order to finish it, but I didn't gain anything from that the way the first 29 cantos made me really feel something. If you like science fiction, I definitely recommend picking it up, and even if you only read the first part, that does feel like a complete story in itself. I could genuinely see myself rereading the first 29 cantos at some point, because I found that part really worthwhile, but I don't think I would ever return to the entire book. Later in the poem of the first 29 cantos, because honestly that's all I can discuss here, but towards the end of the 29 cantos, they witness the destruction of Earth through the Mima. The Mima sees this, and the Mima shows it to the people of the ship, and they choose to shut down the Mima. Not forever, but just temporarily turn it off, because for them, the Mima exists to give them comfort and happiness, not to show them despair. And it's after this that the Mima decides to permanently disable itself. The Mima essentially kills itself, and these people are left all alone. And that's sort of where the rest of the poem goes after this, is that they're left to despair, they're left to fight each other and die, and it was really emotional, and I can understand why it gave my boyfriend kind of an existential crisis, and why we now have a cat called Mima to distract us from our impending death that we can do nothing about. We're just floating through space, and nothing means anything. But I don't think it hit me quite as emotionally as it hit him. He is much more into poetry, into the great meanings of life, whereas I like to read contemporaries that talk about people's relationships and not ask the greater questions of life because it disturbs me to think too much about. But if you're interested in that kind of thing, I do think this is a very worthwhile poem. I think it's very fascinating, and I think it does mean a lot. I just don't know how much the latter 70% of the poem that was added on later is worthwhile. But he read the whole thing, he enjoyed the whole thing, so if you're into that kind of thing, maybe you would as well. And I do think this was a good start for me, because anywhere I go from here has to be a little bit easier than a poorly translated 1950s science fiction epic. I wanted to read a brief section of the poem. Bookish always reads a poem in his poetry discussions, and I really do enjoy that because I think it adds a lot to be able to hear it or read it yourself. So I obviously can't read this whole poem, I wouldn't want to try, but I did pick part of one cantos that I wanted to read. Then, suddenly, I see how all has changed. How all these people, all these immigrants, are realizing that what once had been has been and gone, and that the only world which we are given is this world in Mima. And while we voyage on towards certain death, in spaces without land and without coast, the Mima gains the power to soothe all souls, and settle them to quiet and composure before the final hour that man must always meet at last, wherever it be lodged. I'm sorry if this video was kind of different and kind of less coherent than my normal book reviews, but I do struggle with poetry and that's something I'm trying to improve on, so hopefully these videos will become more interesting and more worthwhile as I get used to reading more poetry and analyzing it. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.